So let's take a look at this TCP IP or DARPA model. As I mentioned, it's a 4-layer model. So some people find this to be easier to remember and easier to understand than the 7-layer OSI model. But either way, the 4 layers of this model are the application layer, which is a layer that we also have in the OSI model. We have the transport layer, which again is a layer that we have in the OSI model. We have the internet layer. I've seen it sometimes referred to as the internetworking layer. I've actually even seen this one listed just simply as the network or networking layer. I like to list it as the internet layer because I think it's a little bit less confusing when you try to relate it to the actual layer called network layer in the OSI model. And then the other reason is because we have the bottom layer here, which is called network access. I think it's confusing when you have a network layer and then a network access layer. So these are the 4 layers of the TCP IP model. Now, as I mentioned, each of these layers is going to somewhat correspond to the 7 layers of the OSI model. Now, just like I explained in the OSI model lesson, there's a lot of gray area here. It's not as black and white. It's not as literal as the way I'm presenting it to you here in this lesson, and that's okay. Okay, because you got to start off just getting the basic understanding before you worry about all the real finite intricacies that they have here. So what I have listed here is I have the application layer of the TCP IP model roughly mapping to the top 3 layers of the OSI model. Okay, so the application layer in the TCP IP model roughly maps to the application presentation and session layers of functionality in the OSI model. The transport layer, I think, is the easiest because it's pretty much a one-to-one mapping with the transport layer of the OSI model. The internet layer, which I told you has also been referred to as the internetworking layer or the network or networking layer, relates to the, well, coincidentally enough, network layer of the OSI model. But then we have the network access layer, which corresponds with the bottom 2 layers, both data link and physical, of the OSI model. So even though it's not an exact, precise one-to-one mapping, that's roughly how it maps to the OSI model. Now, not only did the layers relate to the OSI model, but the functionality is the same as the OSI model. Just like we saw in the OSI model lesson, when you have 2 computers and you want to have data transmitted from one to the other, it starts out on the sending computer, which is up above the model. It is sent down through the model, and then it's put out on the cable, goes over to the receiving computer, and then goes up through the model. If this is a confusing diagram for you, that means that you probably didn't watch the OSI model lesson, because in that lesson, I actually animate this and go through a complete description of what all of this means. So please go back to that lesson and watch if you didn't already see it. So now that we know that this TCP IP suite or model or DARPA model, I mean, there's a lot of different names and it's all the same thing. This is something that relates to the OSI model, but just like we saw with protocols and we talked about in a previous lesson, the United States Postal Service being different than FedEx as far as they have the same general rules and procedures for communication, but the specifics are different. Well, that's kind of like what we have here with the TCP IP model. The individual rules and the specifics are different. And those are defined by the individual protocols that we find in the 4 layers. Now, way up top at the application layer, we have protocols like HTTP, which we use for web browsing, FTP for file transfers, SMTP for email, DNS, RIP, SNMP, and there's many, many more. And I'm not going to worry about defining each and every one of them. Okay, but these are the high-level application layer protocols, and these also happen to be the protocols that very often you will see related specifically to an application. Right? When you're dealing with an email client, you see SMTP. Right? You're actually supposed to put in an SMTP address. You see that right in the application. Okay, and that's because that top layer, that application layer, has that network API or that application programming interface. That's why we see that up there. If I can jump down now to the bottom layer, the network access layer, this is just where we define the actual access method, which we'll talk about at the end of this lesson, for communicating on the network. Okay, so I have Ethernet and token ring. And again, I'll go over those in more detail before we get done with this lesson. But what I'd like to talk to you about right now are the middle layer protocols. We have the transport layer protocol, which has TCP and UDP. And we have the internet layer, which has the protocols IP, ARP, ICMP, and IGMP. Now you'll notice, by the way, that the name of this whole protocol suite is TCP IP, and within the transport layer is where we have our TCP, and within the internet layer is where we have our IP. Okay, so those are actual individual protocols within the model.